Hello and welcome to the Rogue Entity build tutorial. In this part we're going to set up our UI for the build mode so we can place items, and that will involve using a list view. So I thought I'd just use a list view just because I can show how it is. You could easily use just a scroll box for this or a horizontal box, whatever you like. But I just wanted to cover the list view as it's got some unique properties that some to be aware of. It's really only beneficial when you've got a large amount of data to display in some sort of view. Buildable items might be something that you have a lot of eventually. So the list view allows you to display a large number of items in just a scrollable viewport. It's designed to efficiently manage the memory of those, so it doesn't load all your data and display it in like a scroll box would. So it actually loads the widgets and unloads them as they come into view. So if you had, say, 100 items and you only had 5, there would be only like 5 or 6 or 7 or so loaded at a time as you scroll along the scroll box. And the way it works in the back end is you pass it a data instead of a widget. You tell it what type of widget you want the display to be, and then you pass data in the form of a U object, or in our case, we're going to pass a data asset, which inherits from a U object anyway. What the list view does is loads that data into the widget that you have, and that's how it saves on the performance for large lists. So we're going to start this tutorial by creating our data. So I'm just going to start in this data folder here. If you don't have one, just create one. And we're going to create our data asset for starters, and I'm just going to call it prefixing with S again. It's going to S build. It'll be S build item data asset. And that'll inherit from a primary data asset. Of course, I can't type because I'm recording. And the other data that we're going to use is I'm just going to create a H file for like structs and enums. So I'm just going to create a file, and you could do this through Visual Studio as well. Just create any file, and I'm just going to call it sbuilddata and .h, because I don't need a CPP for this. It's just straight H file. If I do need a CPP for some, like I want to implement functions in a struct or something, I could add that later. So when you create a file from scratch like this, you still need the generated and the pragma once at the top, and that'll make it a valid file. Pretty sure pragma once just stops it from being loaded multiple times when you reference it at different places. And we're just going to start with an enum here, and this is going to be our filter. I'm just sort of doing a generic setup for this, but this would be something like if your game had sides or factions or teams, or you could, like say you had a bunch of buildings and you want to change who has access to what building. So like the player would choose their side, and that would be a filter, right? So they'd only get access to their side's building. It also could be something like a level. So the player's only level 1, they don't have access to level 1 buildings or things like that. So that you can, use both those things or a combination. But I just wanted to have filters in there so you could see how you could implement it. So that's all we need now. So I'm just going to, we'll add to this later in the later videos, but we don't need it for now. We just need the filter because it's going to be used in our data asset here. So the normal setup I have for a data asset is the data type. So this is so we can reference the data object, and then just we override this so that the asset manager can look up what data type it is. And then this is where we want to configure it. So this data asset is going to have anything that the object needs that you're going to build. So for now, we just want to display it, right? So we're just going to fill out some display type things. So I'm going to put in, title text, an image. We want to do with our filter. So we can do that now too, actually. Put that up here. So we've got our asset filter, which is our enum that we just created. And we need to reference our build data. So rather than just a reference, I'm going to do an include on this. Like so. And I'm using a soft object pointer here, you can see, for the texture. The ftext is fine. What that means is it won't be loaded. You don't have a hard reference to this, so you need to load it manually. and that allows us to unload and load things as needed. Alright, so now we can get into creating the UI. I'm gonna create a folder just for the build stuff here, just to keep it separate from previous stuff. The first thing I want to do is I just want to create a generic button. Now, if you would have followed on the other tutorials, you would have seen the simple UI button. Simple UI button it passes an index and a reference to the button. We don't really need that all the time, so what I'm going to do is just create a simple button that just overrides a normal button, but we can use it in our menus and things to configure, the look of it or whatever. So if you haven't done the previous tutorial with the simple UI button, just disregard that. We're starting from scratch anyway. The other benefit this button will have is we don't have to pass, if we're not using a reference to the button or an index, then we don't have to pass null and zero and random values, make a valid call to it. So this is going to be a user widget class, so we'll inherit from user widget, and we're just going to call it, we use our X prefix and we'll just call it generic button. So in our generic button, we're going to want to have a few things. We're going to want to have a pre-construct. So a pre-construct will allow us to update, say, the text, for example, and have it show as updated in the editor. And then we just want a button, so it's going to have a button, obviously. And then the text for the button, I'm just adding the references here. And then what we want is a field for the text that we can update. So if we add this to another widget, we can then add the text we want for that widget, and it will be updated in the pre-construct. So let's build that. So first thing we want to do is just check that button text block is valid. For some reason it's not valid. We don't want to have a crash or something. And then what we do is we call a set text on that, and we get our button text, which is the text that we'll apply to it, and then we'll convert that from a string to ftext. And we just need a reference to the text block here. And that's all it is there. Like maybe later you might have some configuration things for, the look of the button. I'm not going to do any graphical stuff here. It'll just be a pretty standard button. But yeah, this is why you would have a class for your button anyway. If you haven't used the bind widget before, this is basically saying this widget has to have a button class called button in it, otherwise it won't link properly. And it's just a way of getting a C++ linkage to your UI. So next I think we'll start at the bottom and work our way back. It's usually the best way to go with UI, because you need to use those bottom references in the upper references. So like a menu will need a reference to the button, etc., etc. So the next thing I'm going to create is the entry for our list view. Again, this is going to be a user widget or a user widget. And then we'll call this S build item widget. As with all your UI stuff, when you're making C++ classes for UI, you want to make it abstract because you don't want to use it as a reference anywhere in the editor, because it will have nothing. It won't have any buttons, it won't have any graphical interface. We can just do, so there's a few things we want to have on our widget. We always want to have an image, text, and a button. If you want to have something else, go for it. Don't want to do classes here. You can do that, but I like to have them at the top, like so. And we're referencing the button as our newly created generic button. Create this. So again, we just want to check that our place button is valid, because we want to bind to the onClicked function here. So before we do that, let's create the function that it's going to call. So I'm going to make that in a protected section here. So because it's going to be called from a delegate, which is the onClicked, it needs to have a U function above it, even if we're not accessing it in blueprints. And then the other thing that we're going to need is an interface to our user list. So the list works is you override an interface and it takes a data and then it applies that data to the widget item, which we talked about before. And that interface is called the user object list entry. You should be able to just include that like so. And then that'll give us a function that we can override, which will allow us to set up the widget. And we're going to want a few other references. Yeah, leave the super in there. And so we're going to want a reference to our player controller. We're going to want a reference to the data. So we're just going to create a data variable, and that'll be our data asset that we created. And it's not the ID file, it's not a primary data asset, it's the actual class that we'll be passing. And then, yeah, just a reference to the player controller. We don't necessarily need this yet, but we will soon, because we're going to add something that'll need it. Let's do the onClicked event first. So if we access the build button, we need to include a reference for that, which is our menu button that we created, generic button. And then we also need a reference to uButton, the Unreal class for a button. So we're going through that to the button, and then we're binding to the onClicked event, which will then call our build item selected. We don't have anything really to do here. This will be later when we implement that. Now the other bit we want to do here is we want to cast. So this is going to pass in our data as a U object, and we want to cast it to our type, which is our data class. So our build item data asset. So now once we have a reference to that, we can then read all the data off our data asset file and apply it to the UI display. So if that is valid, we want to set the text. Pretty straightforward. Need a reference to our text block. We get the text, that's easy. But for the image, remember it was a soft object pointer, so we need to actually load that data before we apply it. So just include the reference to our image. And the way we do that is we get the soft object pointer and we can just call load synchronous on that. And what that'll do is it'll say, is it already loaded? Then just use it. If it's not loaded, it'll load it. And it's synchronous, so the game will actually wait for that to be loaded before it displays it. And nothing else can sort of happen. So you don't really want to do that if it's something massive, but like a simple image is just going to be no worries. Later we'll do an async load, and we'll load all these data assets. So we'll look them up, and then we'll load them all. All right. So there is one other thing that we do need to reference in here, and that's why actually we will assign our player controller, because we are going to need it, using the gameplay static for that. So I've got an include for the Kismet gameplay static there, and I'm going to have an include for our player controller, and I'm using an ensure to verify that, and that'll assign the reference, and it will check that it's valid, and then if it's not, it'll do a breakpoint. And if you do a build of the engine, it'll build this out. But while using the editor, it's a good way to assign something and check that it's there. Right. So the way that I'm going to demonstrate how you can keep your player controller clean and tidy is to break something off into a component. So that's what I'm going to do for the whole build setup. Is it's going to be on a build component on the player controller. So that'll be an actor component. So let's create that now, because we want to get a reference to it here, because this build item will need to talk to the build component to say, hey, I'm trying to place this. What do I do? So I'm going to create another build folder just in the main directory, just to keep all this separate again, because this won't be UI. And in here, I'm going to create an actor component called build component. I'm just going to tidy this up. So one thing we're going to want, and I usually do for components, is I put in a static reference or static lookup for the component itself. I'm going to put that in here. So we want to return the component itself by passing the actor that it's attached to, checking that the actor is valid. If it is valid, we find component by class, our build component that we just created here. I can show you how to use that. So we go back to our build item widget, where we wanted to do the the class here, first thing we'll do actually is in the H file, we'll add a reference for our build component, and we'll include a reference. So our build component, you want to just grab the class, so US build component, and then we can just do find build component like that. And now we need to pass the actor that it's attached to, which is our player controller. Well, it will be. We'll do that next. So now we have a reference on this widget to our build component. So let's go to our player controller and assign or add an actual build component. So I guess the first thing we want is a variable for it. Where should I put it? I'll put it at the bottom here under placement. This is the old placement. I'll put it in private. So we need a reference for that. While we're here, also that build asset filter that we're using, we'll actually put a variable here. So this is where you'd assign the player. If you're using the filter for a side, or a faction, or a team, this is where you would assign, you'd set this to whatever their team is or whatever, or a level. You could also have it in the player state, but won't go into that. This is just for reference for now. So we need to include that data again, the build data. I'm just going to do that manually. Data, let's build data. So that's all valid now. And then in the constructor, we just need to create the build component, which is the same way you do any other component. Add the include for the build component. We now have a valid build component. So let's go back to our UI. The way I want to set it up is we'll have a menu at the top of the screen, which will, at the moment, we'll only have one option, which will be build. And then we click on the build and it'll load the build menu, and then that's where you'll see the list of stuff that you can build. So I'm going to create a widget class for a game menu and a build menu. I'll just create both classes that both use a widget. An S game menu widget. And we're going to want to add another one. And this will be S build menu widget. And we're going to make them both abstract. Build item. I might actually close some of this so I don't get lost. Down with the item. At the menu and the build menu. Close the component for now. So in our game menu, we'll have the build button, like I said, and we'll have a reference to our build menu widget. That's why I created both at the same time, so I can just do that reference there. We need some control over our build menu. So we're going to want to toggle the build menu each time it's clicked or whatever we've toggled, and we'll use a bool to control that toggle. And then when we select something, we'll have a function that's called, and that'll be bound to the build item. So let's build our functions here. So when the UI initializes, we want to check that our build button is valid, and if it is, we want to bind to the on-clicked button of the build button again, and we need the two includes for that. And we're just going to call that toggle build menu. And in the toggle build menu, we're just going to toggle the bool. So we're going to change it to not what it is now. And then we're going to check. So if we do have a valid reference to the build menu widget, we want to basically toggle it so it's visible or hidden. So we're going to use the toggle bool here to control that. And we're just saying set visibility to either visible or hidden, depending on if it's true or false. And it'll be true, false by default, so it'll be off when it loads. And then we haven't set these functions up yet, but we'll do that next. So we obviously want to display what's in the build menu or hide what's in the build menu based on that, and that's where we'll interface to the list view. But so we're going to, if the build menu is open, we'll call display. If the build menu is closing, we'll call end display. And we'll do those functions in a second. On the build item selected, we just want to call that same function again, toggle build menu. So when we select something, it'll obviously be open, so it'll close it. One last thing we'll do up the top before we go on to the actual build menu is we want to set the visibility of the build menu to hidden at the start, so it's not showing up. So again, we'll just check that it's valid, and then we'll set it to hidden, and we'll double check that it is actually set to false. Make sure it's not open at all by default for whatever reason. Don't really need that, but it's good practice to have it in the constructor. The other thing here is we'll need an event for when one of the items is selected in the list to call this onBuildItemSelected. So I have to remember to add that as well as these functions. So let's go to our build menu. So I'm going to have two UI references here, a native construct, and then I'm going to have a menu border so we can sort of hide the whole menu if we need to. And then we're going to have our list view. And then from the previous class, we said we needed three things. So we wanted show and hide, or display and end display, and then we need this delegate. So I'll usually put the delegates underneath the references in case there's anything I need to reference in the delegate. But this one has no parameters, it's just a straight, if the build item is selected, we're going to call that onBuildItemSelected event. So before we move on here, we'll just go back and we'll include that binding for that. So because the build menu will exist in the game menu from the start, we can bind to that straight away. The way we bind to those, we call our menu, ensuring that the delegate's public on the menu widget, the build menu widget, so we can access it, and we add the dynamic delegate to our call list function. So this is just to close the menu when we select something. So back in our build menu, we're going to need a few references here, so we'll put them in a protected, and we're going to need the player controller again, and that's so we can get our build component reference. We're going to add a function here, and we're going to call it on build mode entered event. So this will be what the items in the list will call. So this is what the build component will call when it enters build mode. So let's implement these. Actually, if I click up here, we can build them all. So I just want to put that, check if that menu border is valid, and then just hide that on initial construction. So we're not, just ensures that our build menu doesn't display when the game loads or whatever. Alright, so in our display list, we're going to, first of all, I'm just going to check it that our user list is valid. If not, I don't want to do anything. And then we need to assign our asset manager, our player controller, and our build component references. And I'm using, again, that ensure for that, including our asset manager, the gameplay statics for the player controller, and our build component. So that's all the references taken care of. Now we just want to empty the list. So just ensure that this list doesn't have anything in it already. And then we'll just use the include for our list view. We don't have this function yet, but we need to add this to our build component, and that'll be to get the build data. So we're going to cover the data generation next, so we'll come back to that. So let's assume we have all the primary data assets and they're all loaded and they're ready to go. The get build data will get only the players build data. So we now have a list of all the players build data, and we just want to add that to our user list. So the first thing we need to do is get the primary asset and cast it to our data asset class. So we use the asset manager to do that. That's getting the primary data asset object. And then for our list, we just do add item and we pass the data class, which is our build data. So this is always going to be a U object, and it can either be something you've created and populated, or in this case, it's just a data asset. So now that we've populated our list, we want to display it. So we need to enable the visibility on the list and the menu border that we hid before. And then we also want to bind to our build component, which again, we haven't done. We'll do it next. And then, so we're going to have an event on our build component. It'll tell us when it enters build mode. So we can call this on build mode entered event. And what we want to do in that is simply end the display. So if we go into build mode, we just want to ensure that this display isn't showing, and so we'll call this end display, which is going to be the opposite of this. So we're going to we're going to clear the list. We're going to set the visibility of our UI elements to hidden. And then if there is a delegate bound, we want to remove it. So if we did bind a delegate here, then we want to remove it. I'm just checking that the build component reference is valid, and if it is, and the event is bound, and we want to unbind it. So let's go to our build component now and fix up all these errors that we've got. So we can start with the delegate that we were just talking about, and that's just another dynamic multicast delegate, no parameters, called it on build mode, and then we just need a reference to that. That's public, and that should sort out majority of those errors there. That's the delegate sorted. So now we just need to do the build data handling. So we're going to need a couple of functions for this. The first one's going to be load the build data, and then we're going to have one that's called from a delegate called on build data loaded, and we'll have a reference to the asset IDs that we just loaded. And then because we're loading assets, we're going to need a reference to our asset manager. We're going to need an array to store these build assets that are loaded, and this will need to be replicated because later on when we're doing our placement stuff, there's going to be a client and a server side. So like obviously when you're trying to place something, you only want to be able to see it as a client. If you're playing multiplayer, you don't want to see that someone else is trying to place a building. So we'll handle all that, and that means this needs to be replicated to the client so it can read the data of what it's trying to place. If you're not interested in multiplayer, you can just take this replicated out. But if you're not interested in multiplayer, I think maybe one day you might be, you can just leave it in, it makes no difference. We're also going to need a reference to our player controller because we'll need to filter the assets, and that's, remember we created that variable on the player controller for that. So like if you're doing that on the player state or something, then you just need a reference to that. So I'm just going to do these definitions. I'm going to clean up the class, and I'm going to move tick to the top. Begin play like so. I usually have tick and begin play at the top, sort of out of order because they're just hard to find later if it gets bigger. Now we've got the classes here. I'm actually going to start at the start of the data generation, so it's going to be on the player controller. So let's go to our player controller and begin play. So if you follow the formation video, you can see that it's creating the data here. It actually creates a whole bunch of functions in the player controller, again bulking out your player controller class. So to tidy that up, we're going to palm that off to our build component to load all the data. Because the asset manager can get all the data, doesn't matter where we do it. So we're going to call, that'll initiate the loading of the build data. And because we don't need it immediately when the player controller starts, it's not going to matter that it's async and it doesn't load. So as long as you can't click on the build menu before it's loaded, then we're fine. And we could actually, that make it so that the UI is not created until everything is loaded, and there's ways to manage that. Actually, I want this one to be above. So yeah, load build data first, because the load build data is what is going to get all the data assets. So the first thing we want to do is just make sure that the asset manager reference what we've got is valid. Again, just using that verify macro for that, a reference to our asset manager. Now this is for the asset manager to get all the assets. We have to tell it what type we're looking for. So you can just do that for the string. Probably best practices would be to create a H file somewhere and include it and have your names fixed. I'm not going to do that right now. I might add that later, but it just avoids having a typo here. So you'd have one file with a bunch of macros, and you'd have a macro for your build data. Just to show you what something like that might look like. Sort of how you do it there, just define whatever your variable is. And you can see here, it's like just how you do a text field. So rather than have build data there, I'd just copy paste that define in, and I'd just set it in this file and then include that file. Anyway, so that'll tell it what type to look up, and then we're just gonna say get primary data assets of that type, and then I just want to check if we did get anything. We want to tell it to load those primary assets asynchronously. Async, whatever. So don't worry about bundles for now, just passing an empty array for that. But we are passing a delegate, so this is saying when you have loaded all these assets, fire this delegate and specify this function, which is going to call our function down here, and I'm passing the build assets that I had here. In here, I'm just going to check that I got a player controller reference. I've set that, haven't I? Did we set that? I think we need to set that in begin play. So now that we have an array of the asset files, this is where we need to apply the filter for this player. So we don't want them having access to, buildings they're not into, where they're not the level, they're not the side, or whatever. So what we need to do is get the data asset object, cast it to our data type, so we can read the side that this data asset's for. We're going to check if it's the same as the player filter. Oh, that's another function we have to add. And then if it is the same anyway, we're going to add it to our build items data. If not, this player doesn't care about it. So let's add that function to our player controller. Put it down the bottom again. This will have to be public. So we just want to return the enum, and that's that class down there. That variable. So that is our data loaded now. So if we go back to our build menu, we shouldn't have any errors anymore. No, we do. Oh, because we haven't created the build component is what we needed to update, isn't it? So now that we have the data, we need to create a function to access that data. And obviously it needs to be public. I'll put that up here, and that will return our build data. So the UI can now get access to what build data we have, and so it can display it in there. Right, so we've got our HUDs going. So now we need to get the HUD on the screen. So in the previous video, we covered the SHUD and the HUD widget. So here, this is where we want to keep all our HUD references. So I'm just going to duplicate this. We create the entire game menu HUD. Yes, game menu. So that'll be game menu HUD class, game menu widget class. So when our HUD class starts, it'll create our HUD widget. When the HUD widget starts, we want it to create our build menu. So in here, we're going to want a function for creating our game menu. We're going to need to create a widget. We're always going to need a world reference. So we're going to have a world reference here, a variable, and then the other thing we want is just a reference to the widget once it is created. So I'll put that in here as well. And our forward declaration. So actually we'll just do our world context reference first in the constructor. So I'll just do our same as this, but we'll do the get world. So we should do that first, huh? And then we can use it here. At the end of the initialization, we'll create our game menu. And in the create game menu, we want to ensure that we have a reference to our player controller and world. And that's because we want to get the HUD class reference from our single source HUD. And that is our SHUD actor. And then we'll just check that we have assigned the class there before we go trying to create a widget. So that's there. Why isn't that? Oh, sorry, we've made that protected. So we'll move this to public. This one's fine to be protected because it's created in-house here, but we want a reference to this one. So and then we'll just create the widget and add it to the viewport, assigning it to our game menu variable there, and include a link to that. So we should be able to build successfully now. We don't. So I forgot the replication. Because we marked our build data as replicated, we need to bring in that was on the build component. When you mark something as replicated, you need to bring in the get lifetime replicated props override. So I'll always put this at the top. So I'm going to put it above, just under the constructor here. We need to add the build items data. If you remember, we marked that as replicated. So we need to tell it to replicate. You'll need to include the Unreal networking there for it to get rid of that error, and that will now replicate. We don't need a definition for this. It's just a straight macros handle all that. Once you use the replicated macro, I guess, in the U property, it straight away expects to have this as an override. weird setup, but that's what it does. So let's try build again. All right, let's go on to the editor. So one thing I didn't mention, which I wish I had of in the previous video, was when you create these folders and you move stuff around, particularly when you move stuff is what I'm talking about here, just whatever your folder you move from. So I think I've moved them from contents. So I'm just going to contents and just fix up redirectors, because what Unreal does is it creates hidden redirect files to from where it was to where it is. And if I tried to move those files again, it would have an error, and I should have done it actually. But anyway, just keep in mind every time you move something, just to clean up those redirectors. All right, so we'll start by creating our UI classes. I think that's going to take the longest. So again, we'll create a build folder, just keep it separate. We'll start with our generic button. So widget class, we called it sGeneric button. We'll just name it menu button. Or actually, call it generic button, huh? Button. Now we need to, in our button, we wanted a button and maybe we want our buttons to scale, I don't know, but let's put a button in. We'll put some button text on the button, and then we'll wrap the button in a scale box. So the button, if we don't know what we called it, we can just try and build and it will tell us, hey, where's our button called button? And we need a button called button text block. And they don't need to be variables unless you're going to do something in blueprints in the graph here. They don't need to be variables in here because we've got that binding to C++ anyway. Let's set this to desired. We'll give it some generic text, generic button. See what it looks like. I might put some padding on it, and I might bring down the font size. I don't know, 16. There's an awesome button. That should build fine now. That's our button done. So let's do our build item. So working backwards here again. So it'll be so this build item. And we'll call it W build item widget. So in here we wanted an image and a text box for the display. So again, I'm just going to start with an overlay. Oh, we need a button as well. So it's definitely need an overlay for that because we want the button to take up the whole thing. We'll put in a border for a background if you want to have a background. I'm just going to decide. Let's put the image in so we can actually. So we want to sort the. So I'm going to have at the top of the screen going horizontal across the page, and I'll have an image with text underneath. So I'm going to need a vertical box with image. It's there somewhere, and text underneath. And this was called image, I believe. Again, I'll just check. I'll add some padding to the image. I don't know, 6 again. Yeah, I want it to stretch, but I want to set the minimum size. So I might wrap it with a size box. Let's make it min 128. I'm going to put the background to transparent. Oh, actually, I'll make it slightly transparent. 25. Oh, that's the wrong one. This one. So text block. Definitely don't want. I'll make this 12 and where is it? Gone past it. Centered. Why is this faded out? Did I have them all selected or something? Oh, hang on. Change this back to 1. That's what it is. Yeah, that'll do. Oh, and we need our button. Sorry, I need a button. Which I don't want just a normal button, or do I want our generic button? And I'll put that on the overlay, and then I can stretch that for the entire size, and I can just make it invisible. And what do we need to call this button? Place build button. The text block is title text, and the image, I've done the image right now, yep. So that's our display, so that's what will be created for each buildable item that we're going to create. And now we can do our build menu. So the widget blueprint, build menu, build menu widget. So the build menu is pretty straightforward. It's just going to be that list item. I had a border in there too, actually. That was to call it menu border. The list view. Let's find that. List view. And just so we can show how it's limited, I'm going to wrap it with a size box. And I'm going to make it horizontal. This is the list view box settings, so you can change if it's horizontal or vertical. And we need to assign what widget it's going to create. So it's going to be our build item widget. So just make the background transparent again. Desired. So just so we don't have to create 100 items and it's stretch across the whole screen, I'm going to use this size box to limit how wide it is. So if I want to, I've got them set to roughly 128 image, so I do 4, so it's about 512. So let's just set the min desired width to 512. Sorry, not min, max desired width, 512. There we go. So we got, just so we can show off our scroll bar. I might add some padding to that actually. Oh, it's got some already. That's alright. We used 6, wasn't it? So that's that done. Oh no, hang on, we named something wrong. Oh, they are the list view, sorry. Build items list. There we go. So now we just need to do our game menu. Yeah, I'll keep it in the build file. It's fine. Widget. S game menu. W game menu widget. So the game menu is just going to be pretty much a horizontal box across the top of the screen that has buttons in it. Again, I'll go overlay. I'm going to use our generic button for the build menu. Oh, sorry, we'll wrap that in a horizontal box. So when we add, if we add multiple buttons, then that'll be sorted. And then we'll wrap that in a scale box. Scale to fit, yep. And then this needs to be called, so just button, our build button. And then, oh, we had a, sorry, we're going to add our build menu we just created. We're going to need a vertical box for that. Yeah, and the overlay. This needs to go into the vertical box. So our button's at the top, and then our build menu will be below that. Like so. We need to center this. There we go. That's what I wanted. I want the button in the center. We need to put some text on that, don't we? So build. Build. We've got our build menu, which needs to be called build menu widget. So that is our widgets created. So now we need to assign the references so they get loaded. So let's go to our framework, HUD. We should have a HUD widget, and we just need our game menu. There it is. So that'll be our reference. So you can see that's why we've got this class, so you can just have all our references here, and then whenever we need to assign one or change it, they're all here. It's one spot. So you can close those. So now we need to do our data. So we're going to go into project settings, the asset manager. And you might have less than these if you're not following on, but we're just going to add a new one. This is where you've got to get the name the same as what you had in that text field. So let's just recap quickly. So if we go to our build component, or in our build component. So this needs to be exactly the same as this part. That's build data. And then the class that we did, so it was build data asset, double D. What is it? It was build item data asset, or sbuild item. So that's the base class that we're going to be using. We don't have a blueprint class, so that's fine. I usually just change this to always cook. Doesn't really matter until you go to cook. So that tells it that that's a type of asset that we're going to be looking for. So now we need to create the actual data assets. I'm going to go to data, and I'm going to create a new folder in here, build, and I'm going to create a data asset, a miscellaneous data asset, and it will be our build item. And I'm going to call this whatever it is. So it'll usually prefixes with DA for data asset. I'm going to call this building A. Assign it to the build data so that knows that this data asset is this type. And I'm going to call this building A. I'm going to assign some picture. Don't have any, here we go, there we go. And then I'll make another couple. So we pad out our data, and then I'll just go in and update these. So that should be what was it? B circle or B? I did. C. Should use numbers. It would have done it for me. The needed renaming. D. We'll need one more, so just so it goes off the edge, because I think we'll fit about 4. And actually, I might just create one more to show that we can hide it. So D. And then this, actually I won't do it the last one because that'll make this F. And then I'll make building B. That's for filter 2. So it's a different size building or something. Right. So let's see if we get a HUD. Oh. So to fix that, the reason why that is not happening because we're not assigning it. So normally what you'd have if you weren't spawning it in the HUD widget, you would set it here and you'd assign it using the canvas panel. So to fix that HUD issue, we just need to go into our game menu, and I think I forgot to set the vertical box to it'll be at the top center. So there we go, and you can see the build menu is not working. I think I know what this is. I forgot to, when I was doing the asset, I didn't set the location, so I haven't set the directory for it to look for our build data. So just add a directory and point it to that where we created the data assets. And then that should be good. There we go. You can see we're missing, is it B? Yeah, B. B is missing because it's filtered out. And then if we click and it closes the menu, let's just check that. So that doesn't look like it's clicking at all. I'll just check go back to C++ for a second. We'll just go to our item widget. Yeah, so we're clicking here, we're not doing anything when we click. So I've just forgotten to add that, come back and add that reference to the build component. So what we actually want to do here is we want to pass the data to the build component for this object that we clicked. So we're going to have this enter build placement mode pass data. So if we go to our build component, we want to add a public function. Let's keep that together here. Enter build placement mode, and we're passing the data asset class here. And then the build component can use that to create the visualization, the model, static mesh, or whatever we need for whatever we're placing. But for now, we just want to enter the build mode. We had an event for that. Enter this build mode delegate. So let's just call that, because I don't want to get into all the placement stuff in this video. And if we have a look what that's doing, we subscribe to that. It's our build menu. Should close the menu. So let's just rebuild. Yeah, so she's clicking now. So we want to, okay, that concludes this part 2 of the build tutorial series. We'll in the next part we'll go on to working on placing our objects, whatever they are, and ripping the data from the data asset as to what we're going to place. Please don't forget to like if you found this tutorial helpful, and subscribe so you don't miss out on future tutorials. You can join me on Discord or sign up to my Patreon, where you can get access to all my tutorials early and the project files, as well as gain access to behind the scenes on my current game development. Thank you for watching. See you next time.